You are listening to Preconceived, where we examine the preconceptions that shape how we view the world and the paradigms by which we live our lives. Hey everybody, I'm Zale Mednick, and welcome to another episode of Preconceived. I am joined once again today by Kallie Moore, host of the PBS show Eons on YouTube, an extremely popular show. She's a paleontologist, and she's previously been on the show to discuss the preconceptions of dinosaurs, which is a wicked episode, and if you haven't listened to that, you should check it out. So Kallie, welcome back to the podcast.
Yes, thank you for having me on again. This is great.
It's great. It's very exciting. I forget, I think it was a YouTube comment, like immediately after I posted our last episode, someone was like, please, recurring guest. And I was like, yeah.
Oh, that's so nice.
Well, it was a very well-received episode because you're awesome. And last time we were talking about dinosaurs, and today we're talking about sapiens, a little bit more, I guess it's fair to say, relevant to our lives, given we are sapiens.
Right. Yeah, this is not really my area of expertise. So I'm a paleontologist, not paleoanthropologist or archaeologist. So I had to stand on the shoulders of giants for this one. But I think this is going to be a nice crash course in human evolution today, for sure.
Very, very exciting. The preconception of humans. So
Right. So we got a lot of preconceptions about ourselves.
So before we get into kind of the various human species, I think it would be helpful to give kind of just a brief overview of a bit of the timeline from mammals evolving into humans at all, from primate to hominid, and we'll discuss what those terms actually mean.
Right. Yeah. So let's jump in. Okay, so I'm going to start with the more recent and work our way backwards because I think that works, and we're going to look at this more taxonomically than anything. So Homo sapiens, that's us, that's our genus species, that's our binomial name. Our earliest fossils show up in Ethiopia. It's some type of Homo. We don't know the species yet, but it's about 2.75 million years old. It's a partial mandible, and that's like all we got, but that's the oldest of us. Now, if we back up a little bit from us, we get into our tribe, and that's hominini, and those are the hominins, and that's us plus all of our extinct relatives that have lived since our last common ancestor with chimps and bonobos. And this happened somewhere around 4 to 8 million years ago based on the molecular clock, and some of our traits are bipedal. We were upright. Male and female canine teeth are pretty close in size. Those sound like really basic things, but it's kind of the two main traits for a hominin. Now, there are some earliest hominins.
And sorry, you're saying 4 to 8 million years ago, that's when we kind of separated from chimps.
Right. Well, not necessarily. Well, we do separate from chimps about 6 or 7 million years ago, but our hominin tribe, hominins, show up somewhere between 4 and 8 million years ago. Yeah, and that's based on the molecular clock and not so much of the fossil record, but we do have fossils of early hominins, and there are 3 that could potentially be the earliest of our lineage. So that's Sahelanthropus chadensis. I've had to say these before. I should have them. And they're about 7 million years ago. That's the oldest one. Aurorantuganensis is 6 million years ago, and Australopithecus cadaba is about 5.8 to 5.2 million years ago. So those 3 are in the running for earliest hominin, our tribe, hominins. Now, if we back up again, we get into family Hominidae, and those are the hominids, or the great apes. So we're finally into the great apes. So that's us plus chimps, bonobos, orangutans, and gorillas. We're all large bodies. The males are larger than the females. We lack an ischial callosity, so that's the fatty butt pads that gibbons, siamangs, and many other old world monkeys have. And orangutans, though, they branched off between 15 and 12 million years ago. And the earliest member of that group is Shiva. And they are among the most intelligent non-human primates. So they're right up there with chimps on the ability to problem solve and remember and mimic sounds and things like that, which is really exciting.
I remember when I found that out, because I did a podcast, like one of the earliest ones I did on animal intelligence. And I mean, this is a preconception, I guess. I just assumed chimps, smartest other animal for sure, because they're closest to us. But then the guest that I had she was talking to me about the memory and some of the intelligence related features of orangutans, and my mind was absolutely blown. And there's other animals in the animal kingdom as well, but that's a really fascinating one. Just because we are the furthest along in that tree, it doesn't mean that chimps who are closest to us are the most intelligent.
Yes, exactly. And there's other animals that are completely outside of our family tree that are incredibly intelligent as well. So the gray parrot, for example, it has a huge vocabulary. Crows can problem solve. Bees can problem solve. So our understanding of intelligence is changing the more we find out how intelligent other animals are. Like, some animals have an intelligence level that personhood. So for example, dolphins and some larger marine mammals have been given personhood in other countries. So you can't keep them in captivity anymore. It's inhumane because they are a person. Certain elephants have been given personhood so they can get out of zoos and things like that. And so it's really interesting how far we've come with understanding what it means to be a sentient being. And there's a lot more animals that can see themselves, that have self-awareness, than we're aware of. So
Totally.
yes.
But sorry, I took you off track there. Go for it.
Oh, it's okay.
You were talking about the orangutans.
The orangutans branched off 15 to 12 million years ago, but they're still part of family Hominidae, and that is the hominids or the great apes. So we're all great apes. Now, we can take another step back, boom, and we're in the superfamily now. Hominoideae, the hominoids. And this includes the great apes and lesser apes, which includes gibbons and siamings. These two split off, so great apes and lesser apes split from one another about 24 to 16 million years ago. And some of these traits include upright posture, living in trees, stiffer lower back with fewer lumbar vertebra. We can rotate our arms above our heads, very important for climbing. We lack tails. We mature more slowly. We live longer. We have relatively large brains. And we have these very characteristic cusps on the lower molar teeth. They're called Wi-Fi molars. It sounds like Wi-Fi, like your internet, but it's the letter Y and the number 5. Those are our molars, and those are characteristic to all the hominoids, so great apes and lesser apes. So, all right, we're going to take another step back. We're going to get into infraorder. This is the simiiforms, the apes and the monkeys. So monkeys include New World and Old World monkeys. We have enclosed eye sockets, enclosed by bone. We have dry noses. So like your dog has a wet nose so it can smell better. Our nostrils open downward, and New World monkeys open sideways. Hominoids split from the Old World monkeys between about 38 and 24 million years ago, probably around 29 million years ago. And New World monkeys branched off even earlier, between 44 and 33 million years ago. So we're infraorder simiiforms, and we are together with the monkeys now. So now we're going to take an even farther step back and get into the suborder. I know. This is a long journey here in our human evolution.
But so, it's cool. So far you've taken us to, basically, we're back to the monkeys.
Yep, we're back to the monkeys. And Haplorhini is our suborder, and that's apes, monkeys, plus the tarsiers. So we've added tarsiers to our group at this point. Again, dry noses, we have broad, flat incisors, we have eye orbits that are at least partially enclosed by bone. And tarsiers and the simiiforms might have split around 65 million years ago. So we are back in the early Paleocene now, right after the extinction of the dinosaurs. This is when tarsiers and the simiiforms split. And the ancestor of all the haplorhines is probably something small, arboreal, active during the day, and very similar to somebody that we'll talk to in just a minute, Purgatorius. But we have to make it to our order. So now we have finally made it, order primate. So these are all the haplorhines plus lemurs and lorises. So they're known as the strepsirrhines. But again, all primates, again, haplorhines and lemurs and lorises. We have forward-facing eyes. These eye orbits, again, completely or partially enclosed in bones. We have opposable thumbs. Hooray! We have fingernails instead of claws, relatively large brains. We mature slowly, live longer. Not all primates have these traits, but they define us, you know? And the earliest uncontroversial primates show up about 55.8 million years ago in the Eocene. So I did mention Purgatorius though, because we are at the, well, what came before primate? What evolved into primates? And there's probably a group of little critters called the plesiadaptiforms. And Purgatorius is definitely the most famous. And it's kind of on the border between primate and not primate. So some little shrew-like tree-dwelling critter that probably ate insects. That's where we all came from. And those fossils are mostly found in Montana. Actually, I have a few in our collection here at the University of Montana and a couple of localities in southwestern Alberta. So they were hanging out here in North America. So primates basically got their foot in the door in North America during like maybe the Cretaceous even. So there's a couple of molecular clock studies that think that our order primate maybe go back 10 million years before that. So that would be like 75 million years ago in the late Cretaceous. But somewhere right around there, we got our start.
When I think primate, I only probably thought for a while when I was lesser educated, I used to think that was like the same as an ape, but that's totally not true at all. Primates
it's
go
much
back
bigger.
Yeah. Than that.
Yeah. So it's much, much bigger. It includes all the apes and the monkeys, but then the tarsiers, lemurs, and lorises, all of them are considered primates. Yep, it's a huge group. And we just winnow it down all the way to our tribe, you know?
So let's get, so now let's move back into more, I was going to say present time, but closer to the present time with the different human species. So you've explained how we got to the hominids, would I say?
Hominins, yeah.
Hominins. And then they first appear in the record, you said, about how many years ago?
Yeah, so the earliest hominins, somewhere between 7 and 5 million years ago, is when we get the first hominin species. So again, these are upright walkers sometimes. And the reason why we know that they were upright walkers, because a lot of these are fairly fragmentary remains, is that the hole where the spinal cord comes out or goes into the head, whatever the opening for your spinal cord, is underneath the skull instead of at the back. So if you think about a quadruped, the skull attaches from the back to the rest of the spinal cord, and us weirdos standing upright, our spinal cord comes directly out of the base of our skull. And we start to see that move towards underneath the skull in these 3 species around 7 to 6 million years ago, 7 to 5 million years ago. So those are our earliest hominins. Now from there, we just keep moving. We keep moving up. And I don't have all of the genuses of early humans, but I think I hit the ones that most people might have heard of. So Australopithecus, for example. There are a whole bunch of different species of this. I'm just talking about the genus in particular. The genus was around from about 4.2 million to 1.97 million years ago. So like
a really long
time. Yeah, almost 2 million years. Australopithecus afarensis is probably the most well-known one. It's the longest lived genus of early humans. It lasted from like 900,000 years, afarensis did. And we know them from over 300 individuals. So it's like also the best understood of our early humans. And this includes Lucy. So if something went off in your brain, like, why do I know Australopithecus? It's because Lucy is one. And they grew rapidly after birth. They reached adulthood earlier. They have both ape and human characteristics. Like they had a small brain still. It's less than 500 cubic centimeters, which is like a third of our brain size. And they walked upright, but they also climbed trees. So most researchers think that they probably spent the day walking around upright in the grasslands, and then they spent the night and nested in trees. And the sad thing is, I guess it's sad, that many of the skeletons have broken bones that match injuries from humans that have fallen from a great height. So they think that there was like some kind of trade-off. As we became more adapted to walking upright, but we were still climbing, we became less efficient climbers and started falling out of trees and dying.
That is quite sad.
It's quite sad.
And so I guess evolution said it's not going to work.
Yeah. I think your time in the trees is coming to an end here because you keep falling out. And that's how we actually think Lucy died, is that she fell from a tree and it was a fatal fall and she died. So that's pretty sad. But they lived near open grasslands and dense forests. They lived at this time of a lot of climate change. And so open grasslands were taking over these dense forest areas, but there were still pockets of dense forest that they could live in. And these humans, I guess we can say humans at this point, they were the first to use stone tools even. So stone tools doesn't even come from our genus. It comes from a totally different genus. About 3 million years ago, we find the earliest stone tools, and they are associated with Australopithecus remains. And so they had a lot going for them, even being like tiny little adults, because I think they were only like 1.5 meters tall, if that, about 3.5 feet tall. So they were still pretty small.
Wow, that's wild.
But we now get into Homo, our genus Homo. Again, the earliest version of ourselves, at least our genus, show up between 2.8 and 2.75 million years ago. And then we jump into Homo habilis. About 2.4 to 1.4 million years ago, they had a slightly larger brain case. They had a smaller face and teeth than older hominin species, but they still had long arms. Now, they're called Homo habilis, which means like the handyman, is because when they were first discovered in 1964, they were thought to be the first to use tools. Now, we know tools show up way before, but the name still sticks. So they're no longer the first to use tools. They're just another in a long line of tool makers. My favorite is Homo erectus, mainly because they're like the Energizer Bunny of humans. They were around forever, 1.89 million to about 100,000 years ago. So they lasted over 1 million years. Yeah.
Not to jump the gun, but for relativity, how long have Homo sapiens been around?
300,000, 350,000.
Wow. So I mean, Homo erectus was around. We're babies in terms of how long we've been around compared to pretty much everything you're talking about.
Right. Yes. Yes. And Homo erectus was really kind of a trendsetter. This really kicked off a lot of modern human evolution because
they were influencers.
Oh yeah. Totally. The first influencers, I would say, the OGs, if you will. They had modern body-like proportions, modern human body-like proportions. They looked a lot like us. They lived life on the ground. We think they were capable of long-distance running. They show similar growth rates to the other great apes like us. We found individuals with horrific healed injuries, so we know they cared for old and weak members of their groups. The oldest hand axes show up.
Sorry, healed injuries, as in their fellow Homo erecti were helping them get better when they got injured.
Exactly. Yeah. And so there's altruism already showing up in the fossil record over 1 million years ago, is people taking care of other people. Again, the first hand axes, so these really special kind of teardrop tools that show up in the fossil record. Homo erectus was also our first species that left Africa, and they spread all over Eurasia. They were just everywhere across Eurasia. And again, they're one of the longest lived early human species. And not only all of this other stuff that they did, about 800,000 years ago, they learned how to control fire. And that completely changed diets, and it had there was a lot of things that happened because we controlled fire, but we think Homo erectus was the first that could control fire about 800,000 years ago. So Homo erectus did a lot for our species over the course of their 1 million years on this planet.
When you say they made fires, to me, I mean, you've said a lot of things, but to me, that is like, okay, I can actually picture humans around a fire, and that just makes it the most relatable thing you said, almost like, wow, that existed so long ago. Not Homo sapiens, but something that kind of looked like us making fires. There's no other animal I can think of or creature currently that is, sitting around making a fire.
Exactly. And I think that that's kind of like, I mean, you could almost say that's when like humanity really got started, because we were tool making, we left Africa, we could create fire, we were eating cooked meats. I mean, a lot of these things that we think of as being human, we're finding in much, much earlier species of hominins. We just keep finding more and more evidence, like Australopithecus using tools 3 million years ago. And that used to be just, oh, that's our genus. We were the tool makers. Nope. There were long line of tool makers before us. And then altruism, just taking care of one another. Yep, we see that even earlier. Fire making. Yep, outside of our species still. And so a lot of what it means to be human, we're finding much earlier in the fossil record. And so it kind of changes what it means to be people, I guess, you know?
Yeah. So you've got Homo erectus. They're around
Mhm.
for a really long time.
Yes.
And then what I can think of next is Neanderthals. Is that the next
Right.
step?
Well, there was sort of, I threw in Homo florensis in here, Florentius in here, just because probably a lot of people have heard of it. It's the hominin known as a hobbit. They were little bitty. They've
Ah,
only
I've been
been
compared
found.
to a hobbit with my size. Okay, great.
Your size
My
is
my,
correct.
my personal ancestors.
Yes. Well, you must descend from the island of Flores in Indonesia, because that's the only place that we found them thus far. But they're super
Right.
small. Again, they're like 3.6 feet tall, so 3'6". And they had tiny brains and large feet and no chins, but they made and used stone tools, and they probably were able to use fire. And we're very confused about them, but most people, I think, are under the impression that they're an example of island dwarfism. So when big things move onto islands, a lot of times they shrink. So pygmy elephants or the pygmy mammoths. And so that might be what happened to these people, but they were around for like 50,000 years, which is a long time. I mean, it's still a long time in human evolution. But then, yes, after the Hobbit, well, really before the Hobbit, but after the Hobbit too, is Homo Neanderthalensin. And they're our closest extinct human relative. And they show up about 400,000 years ago, so they're on the scene before we are. And they die out somewhere around 30,000 years ago. I've seen some younger dates, I've seen some older dates, and it just really gets down to the nitty gritties of radiometric dating, but probably somewhere around 30,000 years ago.
So they were around for about 350, 400,000 years. A long
Yeah.
time, but not really, only a quarter of the time of Homo erectus, really.
Right. Again, so I mean, it's Homo erectus is definitely, they won humanity at this point in time. At least we'll see how far we can go as a species. They have that classic large brow ridge. They had a large wide nose. They were shorter and stockier than us. Their brains were just as large as ours, and then often they were actually larger, and this has to do with cold adaptation. So they were some of the first humans that went north. They were like, the heck with this southern route, we're gonna go north. And they did, and they lived in front of ice sheets. So their bodies adapted to these cold environments, and they were very sophisticated. They made and used tools. They controlled fire. They lived in shelters. They made jewelry. They wore clothes. I mean, how do you survive at the front of an ice sheet if you're not wearing clothes? They buried their dead. So there's a lot that we think of as, again, being modern human that Neanderthals did. They're not these dumb cavemen at all, by any means. They
So
were.
where does that dumb caveman come from? Because especially you're saying big brains, you can't really pin it on that they had smaller brains. And yeah, you're saying they're making fire, stones, tools, spears, burying their dead. Why do we have this notion of that? Is there something in the fossil record that suggests some element of that? Or is it just like we're Homo sapiens and we kind of laugh at the thing that came before us?
I think it's a little bit of that. When Neanderthals were first found, people were very confused about them. This was a very similar human relative, but we didn't know a lot about them. We hadn't found their burials yet. We hadn't found their ornamentation. We hadn't found their tools yet. And so I think there was just like this, we don't know what to do with it. And the original researcher that worked on it was kind of this blood and red and tooth and nail type of guy, you know, like humans are violent. So these slow, dumb cavemen were these violent creatures that we ran off into extinction. It was a weird time for paleoanthropology when Neanderthals really kind of came out and got into the public knowledge. And so
And when was that?
we've known about Neanderthals probably since the 1800s, but I think it was in the 1960s when the whole like dumb caveman thing really grabbed on to the public opinion, and they were just like the dumb cavemen. They couldn't make it. It's kind of like how humans looked at dinosaurs for a while. Like they went extinct because they were too dumb to survive. They were too dumb and slow to survive. And that's kind of this weird lens that we looked at Neanderthals. But now we know, no, they were hardly that much different than us because we know that we interbred with them. So they couldn't have been that different. I mean, I
We
guess
interbred with them.
Oh yeah. So at least many modern humans, and we keep finding more and more populations that have up to 2% Neanderthal DNA from
Whoa.
interbreeding events. And these happened at different places at different times. So this branching family tree is more of a kind of braided stream. Everybody knew everybody pretty intimately between all of these more recent human species, for
I mean,
sure.
that's wild. And like you said, I read that 1 to 2% of Neanderthal DNA is in the genes of some Europeans.
Mhm.
So that's wild. When did they start? When did the overlap begin? Because that is what probably blows my mind more than anything. The fact that we overlapped with them, and not
Right?
only interacted with them, but interbred with them. That's wild.
Yeah, for probably about 20,000 years, we overlapped, give or take, depending on the region of where they were at. Because Homo sapiens took a little while to move farther north. So it's mostly in the southern populations of Neanderthals that we see the most overlap, and not so much with their farther northern populations, because they were basically gone by the time that Homo sapiens got that far north. So it was probably somewhere in 10 to 20,000 years of overlap, and within that overlap, who knows how many interbreeding events happened. We can trace back to a few just genetically, but probably happen more often than you think.
And we didn't come from Neanderthals, correct?
No. No, us and Neanderthals definitely share a common ancestor, and we didn't really have a whole lot of time to get that far away from them if we're still able to interbreed. And that gets into what is a species, because species aren't able to breed technically, but we did with Neanderthals. So what's that mean? Should they be really a subspecies of Homo sapiens? Like, it's human evolution because of the interbreeding that we see, because humans interbred with Denisovans, which I'll talk about here in a little bit if you want. We interbred with Neanderthals. Hell, we could have interbred with other ancient hominid species, because we overlapped with them. So like, was a Neanderthal interbreeding with like Homo erectus? Because they overlap too in some areas. And so you see some crazy interbreeding events that could have occurred. That's why instead of thinking of human evolution as this branching tree, we now kind of think of it as a braided stream. So things are just kind of going all over the place. They're in different channels. They're back over in their channel. Oh, now they're over here in this channel. And so there's
I
a
mean, I
lot.
know that shocks me, so I'm sure it shocks some other listeners too, because that suggests if they're breeding, not to mention we know there's a level of intelligence here. So it's not just pure hormones at work. There must have been interactions there.
Yeah.
And what's crazy to me is it suggests a certain level of interaction and depth of connection. I don't know if you'd say connection, but is it possible to know through the fossil record at all any other ways in which they interacted? Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, did they ever live together? Were they cooperative, or it's just too tough to
Yeah,
know?
well, so communication, let's start there. That's the
Yeah.
most basic. Could they talk to one another? Well, actually, a study from this March 2021, found that Neanderthals evolved the auditory capabilities to support a vocal communication system as efficient as modern human speech. So they may have had a language. That means that their ears were keyed in to the frequencies of human speech patterns. And their vocal tract was capable of producing the fundamental sounds of human speech. So not only could they produce the sounds, they could hear the sounds, and they overlap very close with modern humans. So they probably had some type of language. Also, if you look at how advanced their culture was, their civilization, if you will, to be able to get to that level, you need some type of language to become that social, to become that advanced. So they probably did have a language. So in that sense, it was just learning the language. I mean, I'm sure we've all run into somebody that speaks a language that we don't. And so that's probably the level that they had to start with. They had to learn each other's language. But from most people's point of view, Neanderthals probably had a spoken language of some kind. And it was similar enough to humans that we could hear it and they could hear us. So
That's a good analogy of thinking of two people who don't speak the same language, because we can all think about meeting somebody where you really can't communicate at all. And we're not even saying they couldn't communicate at all, but you can think about two different people with different languages and how, well, we can still read facial features, we can still show kindness, and we can still interact meaningfully even without that same language.
Right. And the longer you're around somebody with a different language than you, the more that you will start to understand their language, you know? So who knows? Who knows? Maybe there could have been a whole bunch of dialects that we don't even know about anymore. Now, as for interactions, we have found Neanderthals and Homo sapiens in the same cave, but not at the same level. So they were living in the same cave at different periods of time, but it doesn't seem like those times ever overlapped. So I don't know when these interbreedings were happening, but it doesn't seem like they were cohabiting. At least we haven't found evidence of it yet. That, I mean, it could happen tomorrow. Now, within Neanderthal communities, what was it like? Woo! We don't really know, because there's not a lot of positive evidence for like war, for example. Like, we haven't found a mass graveyard of a whole bunch of Neanderthals that show like club injuries to the heads or something like that. But their remains do show a lot of injuries, a lot of injuries. Like, one Neanderthal had a punctured rib from a spear. So he got stabbed in the chest with a spear, lived through it to tell the tale. Another was missing their right forearm completely, like it was gone. It had been amputated, or it came off in some type of injury. They had a healed fracture on their right foot and a whole bunch of bone degeneration on their whole right side of their body. So something awful happened to them on the right side of their body. But was this just hunting lifestyle? Like, was this just, it was tough to be a Neanderthal and you just had a lot of injuries throughout your life because you're hunting megafauna? Or was this from like conflict? So that's where it gets into like, we don't really know how and why these injuries occur, but we do know that being a Neanderthal was a rough time. It was rough, because I don't think we've ever found a Neanderthal without injuries. So it was a rough time to be a Neanderthal, but there was violence, because we have several sites, and I mean like over 3, or like much more over 3 sites that show evidence of cannibalism.
Amongst the Neanderthals, or between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens?
Among Neanderthals. So in sites where there are no humans yet, no Homo sapiens yet, we see evidence of scraped bone, nibbled on fingers, all sorts of horrible things. And we see it, like I said, we have several sites that show very clear evidence of cannibalism when there were no Homo sapiens present. So the only people that could have eaten the other people were the Neanderthals. And we think it just comes down to resources. You know, if it's a real tough winter and it's between you and the next cave over who's going to survive, well, whoever eats whoever first is the winner. Winner, winner, human dinner.
And Homo sapiens, I believe that we're not completely free of cannibalism in our history.
No, and I mean, there are still populations of people that are cannibals even to this day. But, you know, the Donner Party, I'm sure there's been a whole bunch of times within human evolution where it's like, if I don't eat this other human, I will die, and I do not want to die, so I'm going to eat this other human. But it's really interesting that we can see it clear as day in Neanderthal fossil records. So they did go through some pretty rough times, and it, like I said, it was a rough time to be alive anyways at the end of the Ice Age. But yeah, so there's that. So there was some violence, some interspecies violence. I'm assuming they had to kill said other Neanderthals first before they started eating them, but we're not 100%
so
sure.
what happens to the Neanderthals? When and why do they go extinct? Because spoiler, they're not here today.
Nope. We carry their genes around with us, but they are gone. So what's kind of fun is that we have figured out that they had a higher resting metabolic rate. So they needed more food for the same energy as a modern human. And if resources are low, and you need more food to eat, it's gonna be tougher for you to survive than, say, Homo sapiens that need less food to survive. And then we also had interbreeding events. So maybe they just kind of got absorbed. Smaller populations may have died out, and then others maybe commingled long enough to just kind of get absorbed into humans, into Homo sapiens. So I mean, that kind of comes down to, well, are they really extinct if we carry their DNA around with us? Are we just like this weird hybrid version of a Homo sapiens / Neanderthal / Denisovans/Forlensis, like there's so many ancient humans that could have interbred with one another. So really, what is Homo sapiens at this point? What are we? What are we? But yeah, we think it was competition with modern humans, maybe not in the warfare idea of ages past, but yeah, resource limit, natural pressures that allowed Homo sapiens to survive easier and reproduce better than Neanderthals, and they just kind of disappeared.
Can you imagine if there were Neanderthals around today?
Mm-hmm.
Like, let's say they hadn't gone extinct.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a completely hypothetical pontificating question that nobody can answer, but because I love your perspectives. If Neanderthals were around today, how do you think we would coexist? Do you think we would maybe treat them like equals? Would we treat them like other animals? Would they be in zoos? Like, how it's so interesting for me to kind of philosophize about how we would treat them, because they're more similar to us, obviously, than any other animal that exists currently.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we did interbreed with them.
Mm-hmm.
It's an impossible question to answer because we don't know the exact nature of our relationships, especially now that we are starting to attribute personhood to different species.
Right.
But is there a sense you have about how you think we would have evolved how we would have evolved together if they were still on this planet? Do you think that ultimately the human species that we are would have done what we do to most animals and treated them inferiorly?
Our species is really good at annihilating other members of our species. I mean, just take the Native Americans in North America, the indigenous people here. I mean, we did a really good job almost wiping those poor people out. So part of me wants to say, okay, if we stayed the same, Neanderthal numbers never really lowered and human numbers never took them over, and we still stayed individual, we would have just had like Neanderthals. It would have just been another looking person, they just look different. And I'm sure because of the way we are, there would have been like this whole time, like no interbreeding with Neanderthals, just like interracial marriage had to go through that, so like, oh, you can't breed with the Neanderthals, even though we did it lots of times before, but now we're civilized or whatever. But I don't know. Like I said, anytime we go into a new region, we're just really good at annihilating the native populations. So,
well, I asked a question that I thought was impossible to answer, and your answer makes me feel, I don't actually feel foolish, but it makes me feel foolish to an extent of like, it's kind of obvious because we have the proof is in the pudding, and that look at what we have done. That's
to our own species.
Indigenous peoples. That's all you need to look. If we can treat indigenous peoples who are the exact same as all other peoples,
right?
Obviously, it's not a stretch to say that we probably would have treated them quite cruelly.
Yeah, I don't think we would have done a good job at that. The other thing is if they were really good at staying alive, though, too, on the other side, like they could have found refugias, they could have gotten away from us, they could have, like Greenland would have been Neanderthal land or something. I don't know. But
were they physically superior to us in many respects?
I don't think you could say superior, but they were different. They were more climate cold adapted. So in our world of global warming, they would have not done well. It would have taken a lot more work to cool off, to stay cool. They still need a lot more energy and resources than we do just to have baseline life. So there would have been some hurdles for them to get over in our modern society. The other thing that could have happened is a lot more interbreeding. And so we would have just become the same species. Like there wouldn't have been much of a difference between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. Like it would have just kind of merged together, and then we would have been whatever you wanted to call us at that point. So I think we would have completely merged, or we would have annihilated them. I don't think we could have lived harmoniously together for thousands of years. That doesn't seem like something that Homo sapiens do very often with people that look different than us, or what we think is supposed to look different than us. Yeah.
So
But
tell me a bit about, before we get to just the world of the Homo sapien where we're
mhm,
kind of alone, there's also this Denisovans, which were
mhm.
discovered more recently. Tell me a little bit about those, which are less popular and less well known to listeners, I'm sure, than Neanderthals.
Right. So the Denisovans, like we don't even know what they were. Like we call them the Denisovans. Like they don't even have it's not Homo Denisovans or anything like that. We just Denisovans. And the reason for that is because we have like 5 remains of them, and like 2 of them are pinky finger bones, but they were preserved well enough that we could get ancient DNA from them. So we can learn a lot about at least one individual of the Denisovans from their ancient DNA. But they lived for a really long time, very similar to the Neanderthals, about 400,000 to at least 300 or 30,000 years ago. 400,000 to 30,000 years ago. And we know because of that ancient DNA that they were interbreeding with modern humans and Neanderthals. So again, you have like now this 3-way interbreeding that's happening with a whole nother group of ancient humans. So who knows? Who knows? And that's about all I can say about Neanderthals, about Denisovans, because that's all we've got.
And they were only discovered about 10 years ago.
Yeah, and they're from Siberia and Tibet mostly, so Western or Eastern Asia mostly, Southeastern Asia. But yeah, that's about all we can say about the Denisovans right now. But like I said, all these early human groups were very active with each other.
So eventually we get to a time when it's just the Homo sapien around.
Right.
And like you said, Homo sapiens have been around for about 350,000 years.
Yeah.
Started in Africa. How do they then proliferate throughout the world, and how do they evolve, if they do evolve at all, over the course of their existence?
So again, 350,000 years ago in Africa, we probably split from Neanderthals as early as 600,000 years ago. And by 5,000 years ago, their Neanderthal ancestors spread into Europe and the Middle East. So they moved out of Africa real quick. Yeah. Oh yeah, because they were way farther north before we even left Africa. But the out of Africa for Homo sapiens, we stayed in Africa for much longer after the Neanderthal branch left. And there were probably several, sometimes unsuccessful migrations from Africa over thousands of years. So we're starting to kind of move away from this like, oh, one group left and that was the group that did everything. No, it was probably more like a lot of different groups left, and some of them were successful and some of them weren't. And then you also have the reverse. So people that left Africa that came back to Africa. So they're bringing new genes from up north back into Africa. So this is not just a one-way street. People were leaving Africa but coming back into Africa. That's why we're thinking nowadays that we used to think that no African populations had Neanderthal variants, and it was just underrepresentation of African DNA. And now we're starting to find Neanderthal variants in certain populations of African people. And that's because people left and came back. So they brought their newfangled Neanderthal DNA back with them. And we just didn't have the data to see that yet.
So this isn't just a white European thing.
Right. It's anybody, because everybody moved around constantly. So this is a flow in and out of Africa. So we do get several phases probably coming out of Africa, an earlier out of Africa and a later out of Africa. And it's probably driven by environmental changes and climatic fluctuations, like most things. So Africa going from hot and dry like we know it today to humid with the green Sahara, for example. So the Saharan desert used to be this wonderful lush forest during some of these times. And we have evidence that humans were living in those dense forests in the green Sahara. So as early as we see though, like outside of Africa, there's a real controversial find in Greece, which is way far away, and it's 210,000 years old. So that one's iffy. It's fairly new, so it's got to go through a little bit more peer reviewed before I think people really accept it. But if we think about having more than one pulse out of Africa, 210 might have been a dead end maybe they did make it to Greece and then they died out. We're not 100% sure. But the oldest undisputed traces is in the southern Levant region, which is in the eastern Mediterranean. And it's about 194
And
to
sorry, the
100
undisputed traces of humans
out of
migrating
Africa.
successfully
Yeah.
out of Africa, not coming back, but actually leaving there.
Yep. Goodbye, Africa, is about 194 to 177,000 years ago. So, I mean, about 100,000 years after our species evolved, we started to look for new homeland, basically. And the southern route is the oldest route. So basically just staying along the coastline, because that's where a lot of resources are. If you think about it, you've got mammals, and then you've got marine mammals, but then you have all the shellfish and other types of arthropods and things like that. So usually coastal environments are fairly high in resources. So if we just follow the coastline around, we make it into Tibet, northern India, about 120 to 90,000 years ago. We make it into Southeast Asia by 120 or 70,000 years ago. We move into the Pacific Islands about 70,000 years ago and make it all the way to Australia by 65,000 years ago. The northern routes took much longer. We were like, no, I don't want to deal with the cold yet. So in between 45 and 30,000 years ago, we start to move into the northern areas of Asia. We make it to Japan by about 40,000 years. We make it to Western Europe by about 43,000 years ago. So there's kind of two big dispersals, but there seems to be the largest dispersal event around about 60,000 years ago, where people are just going everywhere all of a sudden instead of just staying to the coastline on that southern route.
Wow. What are there any major moments over the last, I guess, we'll say 300,000 years or whatever period since sapiens have been around? Are there any specific moments that strike you or are thought of as milestones in Homo sapiens evolving, whether biologically, if there's any changes, or socioculturally?
Yeah, I think one of the easiest things to track are the tools. And so that starts out real early, 3 million years ago. But tools are made out of really hard rock, and so they last a lot easier than bone. So a lot of times we can trace types of toolkits through time, and it shows us major advances within hominins overall. So the oldest, most basic toolkit is the Oldowan toolkit, and it's at least 2.6 million years old. And those are mostly hammerstones, stone cores, sharp stone flakes. By 1.76 million years ago, we get the Acheulean toolkit, and that's where that hand axe from Homo erectus shows up. Then a little later in the middle Stone Age or the middle Paleolithic, about 400,000 to 200,000 years ago, we get a much smaller, more diverse toolkit. It doesn't have a name, shockingly, or at least not one catch-all name for it. And this is really into flake tools at this point. So we're adding points on the end of spears. We got darts, we got arrows, we got stone awls to puncture holes in hides and scrapers. This toolkit established in Africa about 285,000 years ago, and is found throughout Europe and Asia by about 250,000 years ago. So it's spread relatively rapidly. And then the later Stone Age, the Upper Paleolithic, starts about 50,000 years ago and goes to about 12,000 years ago. And it's very diverse, super diverse at this point in time. And it reflects our culture, because we're becoming way more cultured at this point. And so we see this increased innovation. We started experimenting with bone and ivory and antler. We start making needles and harpoon points. So really, really advanced tool making by the later Stone Age. But otherwise, I think the other big evolutionary advancement that we can think about is art. So carving things, creating cave art, drawing stuff, thinking symbolically about our world and putting it not on paper, but on rock or in ivory or something like that. And so we're starting to develop a preference for the aesthetic. We want things to look nice. We want it to look different. We're adding our own touches on things. And I think that is probably a huge jump for us. The oldest thing that might be considered art is some zigzag patterns that were engraved on a shell, and that's 500,000 years ago. So that's Homo erectus. but we don't know the intention. Like, was that a tool, or did they do it because it looked pretty, or like why? So that one is kind of on the borderline of like, is it art? Then we also have handprints and travertine. Travertine is a type of rock that's made out of hot spring deposit. And they're little handprints from about 226,000 to 169,000 years ago in Tibet. And they were made by kids that were probably 7 to 9 years old. So again, were these kids making art? It seems like they deliberately did it, but did they do it because it looked cool, or did they do it because it felt neat putting their hand into a squishy rock, you know? Again,
Yeah.
is it art? And then from there, it goes to some red ochre marks in Africa that are about 73,000 years ago. You've got a red hand stencil in Spain that's about 64,000 years ago, and that's considered to be made by a Neanderthal. So they were making art, if you want to call it art. There's a picture of a wild pig in Indonesia that's like 45,500 years ago. Then Chauvet Cave in France with the fancy rhinos and all the lions and stuff. That is somewhere between 37,000 and 28,000 years ago. The famous Venus of Willendorf sculpture, she's 25,000 years old. The Lascaux cave in France that has all those drawings, and they've like, it's 3D mapped, and you can go see a replica of it even, because they don't let people into the actual cave anymore. That's 17,000 years ago. So art we can track across almost every single continent. Almost every single people made art, or what we might consider art, and it's been left behind. We have it. Textiles can degrade, clothes could degrade, but art is something that can last millennia, as we can see. So it just depends on what you consider art is what the oldest art is. But we've been at least making our presence known from about 500,000 years.
Wow. And then when we think about modern times, I think a lot of people probably think about agriculture developing about 10,000 years ago. And then the first major civilization that we think of is Mesopotamia about 5,000 years ago. And that's kind of the beginning of, I don't want to say human history because that discounts the hundreds of thousands of years you've just spoken about, but the human history that we're familiar with. Is that an accurate way of looking at it?
Yeah. So modern human history, it's tough because originally we kind of pinpointed it about 65,000 to about 50,000 years ago, and it's this idea called behavioral modernity. So behavior is becoming modern. And around 65,000 years ago, we think we see this sudden increase in complex technology and cultures. We have abstract thought, symbolic behavior, music, dance, burials, transportation. We become seafaring at this time. Fancy hearths, self-ornamentation. We're decorating ourselves. But as you heard before, I mean, we've been making art for a very long time, or at least decorating cave walls, if you will. So a lot of people think that this happened at least 150,000 years ago, or maybe a little earlier. So we've been becoming modern for a long time. But yes, there does seem to be some kind of peak, oh my God, moment that happens around 65,000 years ago. Agriculture was another big kickoff of innovation. It happened about 12,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent, and there's a whole bunch of different people that started agriculture at the same time. Completely isolated populations of people totally came up with agriculture at the same time. So it was on it, but it all happened in the Fertile Crescent. We started farming wild varieties of like peas and lentils, barley and wheat. We herded wild animals like goats and sheep and oxen. And hundreds of years later, we would breed both plants and animals, creating our new varieties, creating our breeds and things like that. But written history is kind of when, for me, that's when like peak civilization, boom, we can pass our knowledge like from our mouths, basically. It doesn't have to be just handed down through oral tradition. We can actually write it down and pass it to the next generation. And that's written history. And it shows up about 5,500 years ago, again in the Fertile Crescent area of Mesopotamia, but also in Egypt with Egyptian hieroglyphics. They show up almost at the exact same time. So again,
just simultaneously.
Yes, it's just kind of where it was going, and people were kind of going already there.
That's so cool, because that's just showing that evolution is happening unrelated, but in the same way, because we're the same species.
Oh yeah. And I mean, there's a bit of idea like what led to civilization, like what led to this Neolithic Revolution, as it's called. Like, why? And what's really neat, I think, is permanent settlements show up before agriculture. Like, we didn't base civilizations around agriculture. Agriculture shows up as a product of permanent settlements. So we found this year-round hunter-gatherer camp about 23,000 years ago in Israel. By about 14,000 years ago, we had the first permanent communities, and these are stone houses. But then by like 9,500 years ago, we have evidence in Turkey that 8,000 people were living together in mud brick houses. So shortly after, just like not even 2,000 years after agriculture takes off, we have communities of thousands of people living together. And that's, to me, that was shocking. I did not know that. But it probably boils down to just like survival and increased population demands innovation. So like, you get all these people together, how do you feed them? How do you clothe them? How do you house them? How do you keep them healthy and whole? Well, you got to make it better. You got to make more food. Well, how do you make more food? Well, I need better tools. Well, you got to make better tools, so you almost get into like this feedback cycle. Then you also have climatic and environmental changes pushing populations together. You have an increase of religion or spirituality. So new beliefs about the world are coming up. So like-minded people tend to congregate together, and you can settle in areas with the richest resources. So instead of traveling around to these areas, you just park it and make it work in one spot. So it's really interesting. I think civilization is more of a product of cultural evolution than it is of genetic evolution, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because that's a great point. Genetically, or even just through the fossil record, if we were to look at Homo sapiens 30,000 years ago, would we really find any significant differences between them and us, whether it's DNA or kind of just our skeletons?
No, I mean, there's been a little change here and there. Like we're a little shorter on average than our ancestors were 100,000 years ago, and that actually might have to do with agriculture, because if you have a bad crop one year, you're going to go through periods of malnutrition that could stunt your growth. And so we actually see about 10,000 years ago human height rock bottoms, average human height rock bottoms, and that might be because of all the malnutrition that agriculture introduced. But we start coming back up about 600,000 years ago, and today we're still shorter than our 40,000 year ago relatives on average, but we're coming back up. And that probably has to do with like a whole bunch of complex factors between genetics and environment, lifestyle and diet and technology. Like, we're better at surviving today because of modern medicine type of thing. And so we're able to get bigger. We can support bigger bodies and things like that. But that's kind of changed. Our brains have gotten smaller, which is like, what? Wait. We spent like our entire evolution getting bigger brains. Well, now they're getting smaller. So 100,000 years ago, the average brain size was 1,500 cc's, and today it's 1,350 cc's. So we've lost quite a bit, like almost 200 cc's off the size of our brain. But smaller headed babies are easier to pass through the birth canal. That you've got a limit of how big they can get before you can't get them out, and that's bad for everybody. Also, making a smaller brain might actually make our brain more efficient because the neural pathways have a shorter distance to go. So we have a more efficient brain even though it's smaller. Also, it takes a lot of energy to feed a brain. So if it's a little smaller, less resources need to be eaten to fuel your brain. So it might have been a good thing that our brains got a little bit smaller. Otherwise, no, there's not a whole lot of difference between 100,000 year ago modern human and a modern human.
Evolution is the slow process, as you said.
It is.
Before.
It's a very slow. So by 100,000 years ago, our brain shape was essentially modern. So if the brain was as modern as the brain case, then theoretically they had the brain power to do anything that we could do today. But the difference is culture. So we have this culture push. So the brains didn't change, our culture did. And so culture can evolve even if intelligence doesn't. So you get more humans, you got more humans to invent new cool stuff. And if you have like new environments and climates and foods and dangers, you need to figure out new novel ways to deal with them. So these trigger feedback cycles. A new technology appears, it spreads, human numbers could increase further, increasing cultural evolution. You got more technologies, you get more humans, you got more technologies, you got more humans. And so it just kind of compounds. And so it kicks this cultural revolution into overdrive. So that's basically the only difference between us. So if I could go into the past and take a baby, which is awful, I would never do this, but time travel 100,000 years ago, take a baby, bring them into the present, fingers crossed they don't immediately die from all of the new illnesses and viruses and all the crazy crap that we have going on in our modern world. Besides that, that baby should be able to grow up and be whatever they want to today.
That's a great way of framing it.
Mm-hmm.
Kallie, to end, I'm going to turn you into a bit of an oracle here. You're going to predict the future. I guess there's two ways that this could go. One being way, way, way more likely than the other, just based on looking at the trajectory of all of these other genuses and species that we've talked about.
Mm-hmm.
On the one hand, we are still evolving, even though evolution is slow. We are still biologically evolving.
Oh, heck yeah.
And if we were around in 2 million years, we would look a lot different than we do today. Fair to say?
Probably, yeah.
Depending on the factors, the environmental factors that shaped our biology. The other option, which is far more likely, is that we will get wiped out at some point. What is the future of humanity? What is the future of Homo sapiens, where we're at now, and just with your unique understanding of so many different species, not just humans, where do you view this all going?
All right, well, let's think about it in terms of numbers here. That's what I wanted to look at it. In terms of numbers here, what's going to happen to humans? There's 8 billion of us right now. By 2050, there could be 10 billion of us. By the turn of the next millennium in 2021 or 2100, let me try. In 2100, there could be 11 billion people on this planet. That's a lot of genetic diversity. That's a lot of genetic diversity. And that's what you need as a species to be able to survive issues, whether it be an infection, a virus, asteroid impact, a super volcano. You need genetic diversity in your population. So unless our planet somehow becomes completely uninhabitable, think like Venus or Mars in a super short period of time that we can't adapt to, I seriously doubt every single human will be exterminated. That's a lot of people all over the world that has to be affected the exact same way. That's rough. A giant space rock didn't even wipe out all the dinosaurs. We still got birds. The largest mass extinction of all time was climate driven in the end of the Permian period, the Great Dying, and it wiped out 98% of life, but not all of it went extinct. So for me, the chances of something happening that would affect all 11 billion of us seems pretty, I don't know. Maybe that's not what I was expecting you to say. Clearly, it may lead to question, which is always a better answer when it's completely not what I expected. So, when we spoke about dinosaurs, and birds is a good example. When you look back at dinosaurs, people would say, okay, well, dinosaurs don't exist, but we do have birds, which are technically dinosaurs. Mm-hmm. So there's a situation you're saying where, okay, humans might not be the dominant species of the world potentially. Mm-hmm. Things might change where right now we think we're invincible. We might not completely die off. We might still be here, but we might be like by far the minority. Things might look a lot different for humans, even if we have biologically evolved. Mm-hmm. Our influence in our communities, that could change. I looked at it as a binary thing, kind of, that we're either getting wiped out or we're not. But that diversity of our genetics, because there's so many of us, actually means that's pretty unlikely. Yeah, and so we go through a massive bottlenecking phase. So where a ton of us get knocked out, but as long as humanity stays above the viable population size, for most large mammals, it's between 500 and 1,000 individuals, that's still a viable population. So as long as we stay above that, hell, we'll be fine. We may go back to hunter-gatherer because civilization is completely crashed and we're post-apocalyptic, yada, yada, yada. But there will still be pockets of people. There could be pockets of refugia, like I mentioned earlier, just places that didn't get hit as hard. There could be individuals with a natural genetic mutation that allows them to overcome. I mean, just look at COVID. There are some people that get COVID and have zero symptoms. Or Typhoid Mary that had typhoid and never got sick. So you think about these massive pandemics and stuff, yeah, they can wipe out a lot of people for sure. Will they wipe out all of them? Probably not. Even big natural disasters will probably locally affect. It could, throw us into a nuclear winter for years, but humans evolved during basically an ice age. So, okay, bring it on. I'll put more layers on or whatever. So I don't know. For me, it's hard to think about all 8 to 11 billion of us actually being wiped off. Now, like I said, if something happened to the entire planet that made it uninhabitable in, let's say, a human generation of 20 years, yeah, we're toast. If we don't have enough time to adapt to those situations, that's gonna be rough. But again, the chances of our Earth becoming Venus in 20 years, that's like impossible. I hate to say absolutes at all ever in science, but that seems pretty impossible for that to happen in such a quick amount of time. So me personally, no. But again, if we get isolated, if we get these populations of humans that are completely isolated, that's what spawns new species. So you get isolated, you have no communication, you start interbreeding within your own little group. You have these natural pressures, lack of technologies. Some communities may change a little faster or a little slower than others. So you can totally get new species, but I don't think Homo sapiens will change unless we become isolated for, I don't know, 100 to 300,000 years. We'd have to stay isolated. Because if you think about Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, we were still close enough to interbreed and we were separated by about 300,000 years. And we overlap for about 20,000 years. So we would still need a really long time of isolation of a different species. But yeah, I don't know. As long as we avoid a mutational meltdown, and that's when a population gets so small that harmful genes become fixed in a population so they can't get removed from the population, so they just bubble to the surface and you get so harmful that you can't survive because of your own genetic problems. That's what happened to the last population of mammoths. In Wrangell Island, you had this tiny little group of mammoths that got isolated for like 6,000 years, and all of a sudden they just went through a genetic meltdown, a mutational meltdown. You had too many harmful mutations that became fixed in the population and no new genes coming in. And so they just they failed from the inside out. And so again, if our populations kept dwindling over and over again over the thousands of years, maybe still, man, we move around so much. I seriously doubt that we could even stay isolated long enough for a new species to evolve.
Yeah.
I mean, we've spent 300,000 years moving all over the globe. So I don't know. I have hope for us.
It's some amazing insight. One thing from the episode that we did on dinosaurs that really resonated with me was this one line that everybody will have their day. If there's one thing we can learn from the dinosaurs, you were talking about, how the asteroid hit and like they got wiped out pretty darn quickly. But I like the caveat there that we still have birds, right? So what I'm hearing is that it's not as black and white. Humans will likely still exist, you're saying, in your opinion, but we might not be the kings of the universe like the dinosaurs once were. And that's pretty tough to imagine, a world where humans do exist, but there might be a situation where humans still exist, but no longer view themselves as the dominant species or the center of the world.
Yeah, we could definitely go through a period of time where we are not the dominant terrestrial animal anymore. Something else will be. Yeah, it could get tough for us. It could get tough. I'm hoping that we pull ourselves out of it and not destroy our own self with civilization, you know, that good old Drake equation. Like, I hope we can make it out. And also, I mean, we have average species time. I mean, just looking at the fossil record, you can tell how long a genus lasted for, roughly, and you can average this stuff out. And large mammals can last anywhere from like 1 million to 5 million years, I think. Or maybe I'm thinking of brachiopods can last 5 million. And large mammals might be like 500,000 to 1 million years. So we still have, even on the low end, we still got 200,000 years of just our average genus lifespan. And if we go up to 1 million, heck, we could even outpace Homo erectus someday. So I think that the takeaway in this one is that there are a lot of other hominins that were on this planet for much longer than us. And so we have a goal, if you will. We need to outlive Homo erectus, and then we can really call ourselves the most successful hominid. So we have a goal. If you have a goal, you can make it.
Well, I think that's beautiful insight to end on. Kallie, you are the best. I want to say you put so much effort into accumulating all the knowledge necessary and pulling it all together to give our listeners the most accurate and interesting information on these episodes we've done together. So I am so appreciative of all the time you've spent, not only recording, but also doing research into this. And your energy is fantastic and makes this topic that's already so interesting even more fascinating. So thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks.
Where can people, I mean, people know about PBS Eons, but anywhere we can direct people to learn more about hear more about your content?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram. You can find me at fossil librarian, fossil_librarian. I'm not as active as I've been in the past, but I'm hoping New Year's resolution, right? I'll get more active on social media.
I think that's a great thing to not be as active on social media. Good for you.
But Eons now has a TikTok. So if you ever find yourself like, man, this 5-minute Eons episode is just too much, well, we got a whole bunch of 1-minute bite-sized awesome information for you over on TikTok, PBS Eons on TikTok. And then obviously check out all of our human evolution. I think we have a human evolution playlist on our YouTube page for Eons. So if you just want to jump in.
And if you don't know about PBS Eons, you should, and you should go YouTube PBS Eons and watch Kallie and some others narrate some incredibly exciting episodes just about the history of the world, dinosaurs, humans, whatever. It's really amazing.
We have a whole episode on Neanderthal cannibalism, which was amazing. I was very excited about that script when I got it. I love all the weird stuff, and yeah. That one's a fun episode. If I caught your interest with cannibalism, if you're a weirdo like me. But I always love coming and talking. This, like I said, this is a little outside my wheelhouse with human evolution. I've basically kind of ignored it my entire career, but it was fun to kind of jump back into it and research all these questions that you had. And I think we did a pretty good job. I mean, we covered a lot of ground.
We covered a lot. You sounded like a natural. Kallie Moore, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for listening to another episode of Preconceived. Dream tonight about the evolution of sapiens. Have a great day.